Hello, I'm David Viens from Montreal. I'm president of a company called Plogue Technology, and we are specializing in creating instruments, virtual software instruments that musicians can use. We're doing contract work, so we can do orchestral stuff, pianos and stuff like that, but the things that we do inside here are recreations of, we basically take old technology like this Pac-Man arcade board. We're figuring out how it works and transforming that into sound or a piano or a keyboard that people can use and use in their own tracks. So there's lots of hardware reverse engineering that takes place, lots of code, lots of painful hours, lots of tests. But this is the stuff that keeps us waking up early. It comes from my youth, like you probably heard millions of times. My first venture into that was my dad bought us a Commodore VIC-20. And I spent all my Saturday mornings typing away all these little programs that you had in those little books that came with them. And they made some incredible sounds. But it's really up until a point where my good friend Jan had a Commodore 64, and I never heard of it apart from, it looked pretty similar to VIC-20, but that was just like in appearance. Actually, when you saw what it did and how it sounded like, really it was love at first sight. I didn't know much of the synthesizers at the time, although it was the 80s, so we heard lots of them in music. But really to hear a computer or video game machine actually was able to create all those rich tones and speak and have those cool sound effects really had such an impact on me that I decided, for a long time I kept my Commodore 64s up into shape, and I've used them in my own music in the 90s, although you never heard about my music. But I went to computer science in University of Montreal, and after that decided, what am I going to do? Well, let's take all my passions together and let's try to see if we can take these old devices and create something new out of it, because as much as I like the past, those sound chips and those things were quite limited. It's fun and it's creatively interesting to be limited, but at the same time, as an artist, you might just want these sounds in your artist's palettes of possible waveforms or effects that you can use, and this is what we want, really. We are very curious in what else can we do with those things, and the more I buy, the more I learn, the more different sort of sounds I find that these things can do. They're all different, and they can all create different ambiances, different sound effects, different moods. And the fun thing that we can do with our software is actually layer them. You can layer a Pac-Man board, you can layer an Atari, you can layer a Nintendo and make this heavy sound that's modern. At the same time, you can make it blippy and do all the classic stuff with them. So we have Chipsounds, which is our main little product. We released that in 2009. It was quite well received, although it has a few shortcomings, and now we're working full-time on the update of that, and we went crazy, like reverse engineering, like the bar was there and we're like this high trying to do everything. So by the time that this interview will be out, you'll know that we'll have all the Yamaha FM stuff in there, we'll have Super Nintendo in there, we'll have TurboGrafx in there. So we're adding the 4th and 5th generations of classic games in there, on top of improving the workflow and user and everything. We've just released Chip Speech, which is kind of the friend. Well, there's 3 products. The sound is really the instrument side of it. Then we released Chip Crusher, and it's actually an effect where you put your own audio into it, and it outputs as if it's coming from an Amiga, a Commodore 64 when it tried to do sample playback, a speak and spell, and all those crappy old devices that really add character to your audio. And so it can use to beef up drum sounds or anything you like. And through all that research, one thing that kept appearing was speech chips, because early speech synthesis appeared roughly at the same time that these chips and these systems appeared. And each of these chips and systems had all different types of tonal quality in their voice, and they're all interesting and unrealistic, completely unrealistic, and they're all funny ways. And we said, why don't we make the equivalent of chip sounds, but trying to take what's original and unique about these voices and turn that as well into something that you can just type English and make it sing with a MIDI controller, and this is what we did. So how do I describe chip music? Well, to me there's 3 things. There's people using the actual old hardware and completely going into the mindset that they have to create something that could only be possible if they were in whatever period that these things came out on, 91, 92, 93, whatever. And really just abuse of the techniques that were on there, use the same software that was on there, or the same CPUs that were on there, and they run something modern. Like on Game Boy, you'd probably have LSDJ that you've probably heard a lot about. All these systems have different ways to tap into the old sound. This is the first part. The second part is some called fake bit, which I don't mind, because in reality it is fake because it's not the real hardware. But there are means, if you do it well, and I think we don't have a problem doing that. If you know how to do it well, you can really replicate without any sort of you won't make a difference. Your ears won't make a difference between a waveform that comes out of Chipsounds versus a waveform that comes out of a Nintendo. If you're really picky and you check, you'll probably find distortions here and there. But we wanted to be able to allow people to tap into those sounds because they are all unique. They're not just old and crappy and blippy. They're all, each of the sound chip has its own set of waveforms, and they're all very interesting. And they all have different limitations in terms of pitch, in terms of volumes, in terms of what you can do with the modulations on them. And to be able to create new things with these, whether or not you actually mix these old sounds with contemporary strings, I don't mind. I like to see a collage of all the textures because it really pierces through the mix, and it can really brighten up and add a bit of nostalgia, or just, I mean, that's interesting because the nostalgia factor is there for the 30-somethings, the 20-somethings, but there's tons of 18-year-olds or 20-year-olds that have never played these games. They grew up in Nintendo 64 and PSX1 era. So for them, they just like the sound, how it sounds. And this is what we're after. Like, these are cool sounds, and we want modern musicians to use them, whether or not they're making vintage games or pseudo-vintage games or modern orchestrations. We don't mind. Just be creative and use them for fun. So the Konami VRC7 is an FM chip that was also used in one Famicom cartridge. That's over here, Lagrange point. So there's only one game using this sound, and it actually added FM sound to the Nintendo, the original Famicom. So for instance, what we would do is we take that apart, take the sound chip from there, devise a little platform in there so that we can talk to it and run it and actually put voltage through it and buffer the audio that comes out, and make sure that we can actually be able to talk to it through modern means. This is usually USB in our case. So what we do is we have computer software, and we can, depending on the chip, we can actually tell it, like one after the other, like, make me a waveform at this particular volume, and we look at the outputs with scopes, with logic analyzers and stuff like that. And in parallel to that, we actually try to replicate this, and then we see how our output matches the output of the real thing. And it's an iterative process. It could be weeks, it can be months. And at one point, we have a model where whatever we send to the chip, we actually know that the same thing comes out on both ends, our emulation and the real chip, and that's where we're happy. And from then, we need to make the musical layer on top of it. So that's a whole different story. But the way we approach this, depending on the chip, is really take it apart and put it onto a medium where we can really, outside of the context of where it comes from, to be able to really have full control over its inputs and outputs. So we control it completely. So that's really it. For instance, the better example would be the Atari 2600. The TIA chips can really do one scale when you're lucky, because it's really, you know that. you've worked a lot and you wrote about it. So what we do is, but it's sad because the TIA chip in the Atari creates those wonderful distortions and saw sounding and very unique sounds. So it'd be a waste not to allow the musicians to be able to use that in equal temperament or whatever scale they want to in. So what we do is usually we have a switch where you can put back the limitations or remove them easily. But we see from the results we have, nobody uses the old limitations, even to make sound effects. They find it's too limited. But the real challenge is really trying to make something musical out of an Atari. It would be the SID, like everyone would say the SID, I guess. Just the amount of waveforms, and not only just the waveforms and the character, but all the tricks that have been done. The infamous wavetables, the fact of changing wave shapes in a timed manner, and the arpeggios and all that stuff really, for me, triggers like shivers right away. Rob Hubbard in particular, yeah, his stuff. This is a TSI Speech Plus calculator made in 1975, and it uses the first integrated circuit that actually did speech. It's the first one. There were Speak and Spells that came out after it, but this is the first one. And as you can listen to, there's a really robotic tone. It's because all pitch information has been removed, because that costs that is data, excess data that you don't really need, though inflections in English is fun. So basically what we've done is we've gathered all these old devices that really had these robotic and alien tones, and the same thing as we did with Chipsounds, we reverse engineered the components inside, and we decided to make a synthesizer, although it's completely different because we wanted it to sing. And sing what? English. So that's not just MIDI. You need to do something else. So you need to have text parsers. You need to have something that understands phonetic data. So we've transformed all of these models, these chips, and the data it contains into a huge database of phonemes and transitions that the software can in real time play back to you depending on what you've typed in. And you can add modulations, inflections, and all sorts of stuff live to make it sing in portamento, vibrato, tremolo, all that stuff. You can go crazy and make these old speech synthesizers sing again. So there are plenty. There's the Vocaloid, there's Utao, there's plenty. I mean, it's not the first speech singing product out there, but we wanted to tap really an untapped territory where we want all these old and crappy things that people don't want, because we don't want to answer the phone and be talked that way, although I would find it cool. And as you might see from the product, they all have their different characters and charm. And to be able to make a full choir out of all these characters is quite interesting. We also made virtual avatars of them with personalities and backstories, and kids loved them. Just as like Hatsune Miku has her own persona, but we wanted to have the total opposite, the darker tones, the more robotic and cybernetic and cyberpunk and steampunk kind of elements to it as well, to reflect the older and grittier and neuromancer stuff. There's multiple types of people interested in chip music, and the casual ones have gigs to do, they have soundtracks to make, they're movie composers, video game composers that are actually used to being in a DAW. They use strings, they use pianos, they use all sorts of stuff, but sometimes they have a particularly fixed schedule in which they need to have vintage video game sounds or tones in there. So they could go ahead and fetch a Game Boy or something like that, but it doesn't integrate into their workflow, and that we know because we're one of them. So basically they take a license of Chipsounds and they add whatever they want in there. For instance, there are plenty, but the one that uses most is Portal 2. The original goal in Portal 2 was that to have some vintage technology. The old robots and everything you see in this is vintage, so they needed to sound vintage. Mike Moraski initially wanted to go back to the hardware, but in a tight schedule like that, he could have done it, but he found Chipsounds and he decided to use it directly into the game. And he's probably abused in each and every single one of the sounds in there, from Atari tones at the really start where the action kicks in. You hear some Atari buzz noises; they're incredible. At some points in a cave or in a a very echoey room, you only hear the infamous triangle waveform from the Nintendo, the NES, going boo-doo, doing a simple pattern with lots of echo, and it's only that. It's just beautiful. And sometimes there's stuff all over the place, really the metallic-ish grinding noises, pre-processed, because I don't mind. He's pre-processed the sound and transformed them and time stretched the outputs, and he went crazy into some of that. So I like creative uses. As much as I like recreations, I also like what can you do that's new with these sounds.